In the 10th century, a Florentine diplomat spent years observing the most powerful men in Europe: kings, popes, generals, tyrants. And he also studied with the same scientific detachment the women who knew men best, those who made a living understanding what truly motivates a man, those who couldn't afford to be deceived by romantic notions, those who needed to read a man in a matter of minutes or pay a very high price for being wrong. What Machiavelli found in that observation was not what he expected. He didn't find one type of man who dominated and another who was dominated by his circumstances. He found a pattern that repeated itself with disturbing consistency, a set of behaviors that made certain men immediately legible, predictable, manageable, and others their complete opposite. That pattern is what we're going to dissect today with precision, without condescension, without the watered-down version that makes the information easier to swallow but loses all its real usefulness. Let's start with the historical context that most people omit when talking about Machiavelli. Because Machiavelli wasn't an armchair theorist. He was a field observer, a man who spent decades in the most dangerous courts in Europe, at a time when misreading another man's character could cost you your life. Literally, not metaphorically. In 15th and 16th century Florence, the courtisani and high-ranking courtesans were not simply prostitutes in the modern sense of the word. They were women with a level of social intelligence that most men of their time could not match. They spoke Latin, played instruments, understood politics, knew about philosophy, and above all, knew how to read men in a way that no institution of the time taught, because their survival depended on it, not on pleasing everyone, on accurately identifying what kind of man they had in front of them, to gauge exactly how much real power that man had over himself, and to know, before he knew it, whether that man was the type who would pay what he owed, or the type who at the end of the encounter would try to renegotiate the debt from a position of manufactured superiority. Machiavelli studied his observations with the same seriousness with which he studied Cesare Borgia, because he understood something that very few men of his time understood: that people who live by reading others without the filter of romantic illusion have access to a truth about human nature that those who live within the official moral system will never be able to see. And what he found was this: that most of the men who came through that door became, within minutes, just one of them. Not because they were bad people, not because they were stupid, but because they activated, completely automatically and unconsciously, a series of behaviors that made them absolutely transparent, absolutely predictable, and therefore absolutely controllable. What were those behaviors? Let's look at them one by one. And as you listen, I ask you to be honest with yourself, because there's a huge difference between recognizing these patterns in others and having the courage to recognize them in yourself. The first behavior: the compulsive need to justify oneself. The man who becomes just another face in the crowd enters any interaction unconsciously, feeling the need to prove something, to show he's better than he seems, to have more than meets the eye, to show that his life is more interesting, more successful, more complex than the other person might initially assume. And this need makes him talk too much, explain too much, and offer information that no one asked for. Machiavelli identified it as the clearest sign of a man who has not resolved his relationship with his own worth. Because the man who knows his worth doesn't need to convince you of it. He doesn't need to build the case before you. He doesn't need your verdict to operate from the security of one who knows where he stands. Compulsive justification is always a form of asking for permission, and the man who asks for permission to exist has already lost before any real interaction even begins. The second behavior is generosity that buys approval instead of expressing abundance. There are two types of generosity that Machiavelli distinguished with brutal clarity. The generosity of the man who gives because he has and because he chooses to give. And the generosity of the man who gives because he fears that if he doesn't give, the other person will leave, lose interest, or discover that without material resources, without gifts, without constant willingness, there is not enough reason to stay close. The first form of generosity generates respect. The second generates something much more dangerous. It generates dependence of the giver on the receiver. And in that reversal of the dynamic, the one who seemed to be giving turns out to be the one who needs the relationship the most. The courtesans that Machiavelli studied identified this pattern in less than an hour. Because the man who inspires fear gives too much, he gives without being asked. He gives anticipating a need that perhaps doesn't even exist. And in that overgiving, he reveals everything he tries to hide. That without that generosity, he feels he has nothing to offer. The third behavior, the immediate conversion of any sign of interest into certainty of conquest. This is perhaps the most widespread and the most devastating in terms of what it reveals about the psychology of the man who exhibits it. The man hungry for validation turns every ambiguous sign into confirmation of what he wants to believe. A smile becomes a promise. A pleasant conversation becomes a special connection. A quick response to the message becomes proof of genuine interest and begins to act accordingly, to invest emotionally in something that does not yet exist, to behave as if one has already won something that no one has given one. Machiavelli observed that this behavior has a very specific root cause. The man who turns signs into certainties is not reading reality. He is projecting onto reality what he needs to be true. And that projection is the clearest sign of a man who operates from scarcity, from the feeling that opportunities are rare, that this moment may not return, that it is better to hold on to what seems promising before it disappears. The man who operates from abundance doesn't need to turn anything into certainty. He observes, evaluates, decides calmly, and doesn't commit his emotional energy to something that hasn't yet proven itself worthy of that investment. The fourth behavior is the inability to sustain mystery. Machiavelli wrote about this from the angle of political power, but the mechanics are identical in any kind of human relationship. The prince who reveals all his plans loses the ability to surprise, and the man who cannot surprise is a man whom his surroundings have stopped observing closely. The man who becomes just another face in the crowd talks too much about himself too soon. He reveals his insecurities before anyone even asks. He shares his fears as if immediate vulnerability were synonymous with depth. He recounts his plans before executing them. He explains his motivations when no one has questioned them. And in this total delivery of information, he eliminates any possibility that the other person has to invest attention in understanding him. Because human attention always flows towards the incomplete, towards what is not entirely clear, towards the space between what is said and what is intuited is not being said. The man who reveals everything at once leaves no room for the other person's imagination to work in his favor. And without that space, there is no tension. Without tension, there is no sustained attraction of any kind, romantic, social, or professional. The fifth behavior, and this is the one Machiavelli considered the most definitive of all, the one that left no ambiguity about the type of man you had in front of you, the reaction to rejection or indifference. The man with real power over himself does not change his behavior when he receives indifference. He does not push further. He does not explain further. He does not seek to understand what he did wrong in order to correct it. He simply remains who he is because his identity does not depend on the outcome of that specific interaction. The man who becomes just another face in the crowd reacts to indifference with escalation. He tries harder, offers more, seeks out the angle he hasn't yet tried. Or he reacts with dramatic withdrawal, with silence calculated to be noticed, with absence designed to generate the concern that presence failed to create. Both reactions reveal exactly the same thing, that the outcome of that interaction matters too much, that the validation that could come from it is something that man needs and does not have from any other source,
The way you looked at me
and
across
that,
this very
therefore,
table.
his
I noticed
behavior
every
can be
detail, your
predicted
expression,
and directed
moment
by
of connection.
anyone who
It was
understands that
precise,
mechanism.
and it's why